Okay, so a bit of background to this. For those of you who don't know, over 4,000 prisoners across Australia are currently serving sentences of 12 months or less. Nearly 2,000 of them are serving sentences of 6 months or less. And this is very expensive. It's costing essentially $330 million recurrent each year, not counting the cost, of course, of building new prisons to keep these people in prison. The distinctive feature about short sentences is that if you keep someone locked up for a short period of time, by definition you get very little incapacitation effect. In case you're not aware, the incapacitation effect is the benefit you get when someone simply can't offend. So if it's a short prison sentence, most people aren't offending at a very high rate, even if they've been offending for a long period. So you don't get much benefit in terms of incapacitation. But corrective services, I think, will tell you that 12 months and certainly 6 months is not a lot of time to try and rehabilitate an offender. So really that leaves you with the question of whether or not a short prison sentence has any deterrent effect. If it doesn't have a great incapacitation effect, if it doesn't provide many opportunities for rehabilitation, does it actually deter the people who get them? Well, past research doesn't give us much guidance on this. 2006, Velitas, Kilias and Zoda did a review and concluded that they're unable to say whether non-custodial sanctions are more effective in preventing reoffending than custodial sanctions. Then a few years later, Nagin, Cullen and Johnson came to a somewhat more confident conclusion. They argued that compared with non-custodial sanctions, incarceration appears to either have no effect or a mildly criminogenic effect, meaning makes things worse on future criminal behaviour. And then Velitas, Guilleron and Kilias in 2015 came to the conclusion that a majority of the selected studies show non-custodial sanctions to be more beneficial in reducing reoffending, but they didn't actually find any significant difference in their meta-analysis looking at the best controlled studies, the randomised control and the natural experiment. I mean, the obvious problem with this sort of thing is that sanctions aren't allocated at random. In an ideal world, for a statistician, they would be. So, all right. And that means, of course, that the effect of prison is tangled up with any pre-existing differences in offenders. Everybody knows that randomised controlled trials are the best way to eliminate what's called selection bias, but randomised controlled trials are very difficult to run when you're talking about being randomly allocated to prison. Although I'm here to tell you, and this doesn't surprise me in the slightest because I worked in Switzerland for a while, but in Switzerland, I was only driving a bus, I didn't have any fancy appointment. But in Switzerland, I actually did run a randomised trial of custody. They were short periods in custody, but I don't know how the offenders felt about it. Anyway, normally you'd think, well, that's okay, we'll just do what Neil did and we'll take our traditional regression methods as a means of controlling for other factors that might make for differences between those who go to prison and those who don't. But when you get into this context, regression analyses have their problems. One of them is that you can nominally control for a variable and still have differences between treatment and control groups in that variable. So for example, you can nominally control for age and still have a higher average age in one group than in another group, or have some people over, say, 50 years of age in one group but not in the other group, even though statistically you think you've controlled for age. So we need some way of matching offenders so we can see the true effect of prison. Well, Judy's going to go into a lot more detail about this, but I'm just going to give you a kind of 30,000 foot overview of it. The method we use is called propensity score matching, and I'll just take you gently through it. Basically you start off with a large sample of offenders, all of whom could have gone to prison in this context, but only some of whom did. Then the next step is to estimate what's called the propensity score, which is really just a fancy name for the probability of going to prison. You'd use logistic regression such as Neil's used to try and work out the likelihood of going to prison according to various characteristics of the offender, like their prior record and so on. The next step is to find pairs of people who have very similar propensity scores, who are very similar in their likelihood of going to prison, one of whom went to prison and one of whom didn't go to prison. And then you compare reoffending for these matched pairs of offenders. Now the neat trick about this is that if you make people identical or close to identical in terms of their probability of going to prison, by implication you've actually made them identical in terms of the factors that went into predicting their likelihood of going to prison. If that's a bit obscure, it'll become a lot clearer when Judy starts talking and I stop. Anyway, so the current study, what we do is we compare offenders given a prison sentence with offenders given a suspended sentence. We pick that particular sanction because at least technically, you've got to decide the person's got to go to prison before you can impose a suspended sentence. So that kind of makes them a little bit closer to the treatment group in terms of those characteristics that determine prison. We focus on the first prison sentence on the assumption that if you're up to your second or your third or your fourth or whatever prison sentence, any deterrent effect of prison may have worn off. You may be just the kind of person who's completely unmoved by going to jail. We measure reoffending in terms of the time to the next proven conviction for an offence committed after the index court appearance. So for those of you who are worried about pseudo convictions, we're not counting court appearances per se, we're counting proven offences that occur after they get the sanction. And lastly, we take into account any time spent in custody. So I'll now pass over to Judy, who'll tell you what really happened.
Don. So as a lot of people in this room already know better than me, a suspended sentence is when a court decides that a custodial sentence is appropriate for a person, but if it's less than 2 years, they can decide that that sentence will be suspended instead of executed immediately. That means that the person continues to stay in the community on a good behaviour bond, on the understanding that if that bond is breached, then the original sentence is confirmed and they go into custody. And as Don said, the important part of that is that we have a group of people who all could have gone to prison for less than 2 years. Our data source, again, a lot of people in this room have used the ROD reoffending database, a fantastic source of information, which we extracted information about court appearances from 2008 to 2010, but also a lot of information about these people's previous offending, previous time in custody, some demographic information, and also how long it took them to reoffend if they reoffended. So the sample that we defined was everyone with a proven offence in a New South Wales local court in 2008 to 2010 who had never before been sentenced to prison and who on that index occasion either got a prison sentence of less than 12 months or a suspended sentence of less than 24 months. So we picked that because people getting longer prison sentences probably weren't as comparable. And over the 3 years, that ended up being 15,000 people. As Don described, the first step of the analysis was to estimate the likelihood that each person was sentenced to prison. And the variables we included in the logistic regression to estimate that probability were ones suggested by previous analysis or by your own common sense as ones that were likely to be related to what sentence someone got, as well as whether or not they were likely to reoffend. So the 4 types were who the person is, their prior criminal history, what they were currently being sentenced for, and an evaluation of the dynamic risk factors for their reoffending. So the LSIR score has scales which measure things like education, alcohol and drug issues, and family and relationship status. But otherwise, they're all fairly standard predictors. Oops. And what we got for each person was a single number estimating how likely they were to get a prison sentence, likelihood or propensity, which ranged from nearly 1 to people who were almost certain to go to prison, down to 0 for people who were very unlikely to go to prison. We've done this separately on the left and the right for people who got a suspended sentence and a prison sentence. You can see that there were a lot of people with a very low propensity to go to prison, especially among those who, if in fact, did not go to prison. The length of each line shows the number of people at each propensity score. This longest line is a group of more than 2,000 people with a suspended sentence who had a propensity between 15 and 20% of being sentenced to prison. And at the top is the people who were quite likely to go to prison, and you can see that there are fewer people up there, especially on the suspended sentence side. So then, as Don said, the next step is to create matched pairs of people with similar propensity scores with 1 from each type of sentence. For more details on the study, feel free to pick up a paper copy or look on the website for the in-depth report. This is the overview. And this is how the matching looked. When we took one person from each side, we got these darker bars of people that were able to be matched. And you can see that out of the people with the low propensity scores, there was simply no one in the prison group to match with them. And there are also some people with a high likelihood of going to prison, and there were no suspended sentence people to match with them. But overall, out of everyone who went to prison, we managed to find matches for 86% of them. Not great, but pretty good. So just to clarify, the sample before matching is the whole 15,000 people that we started with, and the sample after matching is about 8,000 people, which consist of 4,000 matched pairs. So the next figure talks about how we could check whether the matching had worked. If you remember that what we're trying to do is to create two similar groups of people. Before matching, the prison and suspended sentence groups were different in lots of ways. So unfortunately this is quite tiny, but if you believe me, this is a list of all of the predictors that we put into the regression model, and the length of each line indicates how different the prison sentence and the suspended sentence groups were before matching. And then, and so you can see that some of the lines, you probably can't see actually, I can tell you that the differences were up to about 14% for some levels of some predictors. On the same scale, this is the after matching. Okay, so looking just at the matched groups, the differences were within plus or minus 1% on all of the predictors that we had that went into the regression model. So that's why I'm going to claim that prison and suspended sentence groups had similar levels of all the predicted values after we'd done that matching process. So the outcome was comparing these two groups in terms of how long it took before the next new offence that was proven in court. As Don said, we looked at the time of the next offence after the one at the index offence, but only ones that were proven. So this is another interesting graph that I'll again take you through slowly. It's called a survival curve. So it's the survival of how long people survive before they commit a new offence. And it's estimated 3 days before the first new offence. That means that for people who got a suspended sentence, day 0 is the day they get that sentence and they survive until they commit a new offence. For people who went to prison, day 0 is the first day they leave custody. So we're assuming that people can only offend once they've left custody. So we start at day 0 and go up to about day 2000. That means we've got up to 5 years of observation for some people, ones who offended at the beginning of our collection period. And we're looking at the proportion of people surviving without reoffending, which starts at 1 before anyone's had a chance to reoffend, and after about 5 years drops down to about 50%. We have separate lines for the prison sentence and the suspended sentence, and you can see that the blue line with the prison sentence drops more quickly as those people reoffend more quickly. But this is a graph before matching. This is the whole 15,000 people. The next graph I'm going to show you is what happened with the matched groups after matching. And you can see that in this matched group, there is no difference in the time it takes to reoffend between people who got a prison sentence and a suspended sentence. So, in conclusion, short prison sentences, less than 12 months, are not effective at deterring future offending, or at least they're no more effective than a suspended sentence, if you're comparing similar people, which we did in the matching sample. That is consistent with the previous samples, the previous studies showing that a custodial sentence has little or no effect on future criminal offending, and if anything worsens it, but doesn't seem to worsen it in this matched sample. have some limitations in that because we were only looking at prison sentences less than 12 months, we can't apply the results to longer prison sentences. It may well be that longer prison sentences have more effect. We're only looking at people with no previous sentence to prison, but among our sample there were some people who had experience of being in custody. For example, they might have been on remand for a considerable amount of time, but then not eventually sentenced to prison for whatever they were on remand for. Also, we could only match on the information that we had available. It's a common problem. There could still be important differences between the groups that we weren't able to capture on the variables that we had available. And so now Donna's going to talk about the policy implications.
Thanks, Judy. There are two messages coming out of this research. I think the first one is that if you're a judge or a magistrate and you're thinking of imposing a prison sentence at the margin because you imagine that this is going to make the community safer, for this class of sentence, there's really nothing in it. You'd be better off in some ways, at least from a financial point of view, if not from the point of view of reducing the criminogenic effect, if there is one, of being in custody, better off putting them on an uncustodial sentence. But that raises the question of what non-custodial sentence should you apply? The state has, over the years, tried to create alternatives to custody, and many of you will know that these haven't been adequately used. Home detention, for example, and intensive correction orders together still only account for less than 2% of all the sanctions imposed by the courts, and neither seem to have had a huge effect in reducing the number of people going into custody. For my money, I think the Law Reform Commission got it right when it pointed out that these are good options but constrained by some unhappy aspects. For example, with the intensive correction order, for some reason or other I've never fully understood, it comes with a requirement for community service. Some people simply can't perform community service because they've got some physical disability or intellectual disability. But really an ICO, as they call it, is really designed to try and rehabilitate offenders, and I think it would be good to consider removing the requirement for community service and just focusing on it as an option for people who could benefit from intensive supervision and treatment as well. Same for home detention. I know there are people here who know more than I do about why it's not more widely used, but I think it's a suitable option for people who are on the cusp of going to jail and for whom the court thinks might be suitable candidates, but for the fact that the resources aren't there to supervise the person. In other words, I think that there are alternatives that could be better used than short sentences of imprisonment, and that's it from me, folks.